So much of the conversation in our industry is about, are we going back to the office? Are we going back to the way things were before the pandemic? Of course, I'm a big believer in going back to the office and doing things in person, building those relationships. But it would be a mistake not to also reflect on what are the things that we've learned over the last year and a half.
Hi, this is Matt Sleppen, and welcome to Leading Voices in Real Estate. Today's episode is a conversation with Sam Shandon, who leads the Schack Institute of Real Estate at NYU, which is the largest graduate and also now undergraduate real estate program in the world. This is our first annual Back to School episode. Sam and I talk about the value of real estate education and training for the future leaders of our business as our real estate industry addresses increasingly complex issues around climate change, urbanization in our major cities and now what used to be called secondary cities, social equity issues, diversity in our business, and now with the continued hills and valleys of COVID, public health. This was a really wide-ranging conversation. Thank you to our sponsor, Terra Search Partners. As recruiters in the real estate business, we're always thinking of the skill sets, experiences, and sensibilities of that next generation of leaders in the business. So this is a particularly apt conversation. I hope that you're enjoying Leading Voices. If so, please follow us on your favorite podcast app, and please share this and other favorite episodes with a friend, especially this one with someone in their 20s considering a grad school degree. And as always, feel free to email me at matt@terrasearchpartners.com with comments, questions, or guest suggestions. Enjoy the conversation with Sam. So, Sam Shandon, welcome to Leading Voices. I am really pleased to have you as a guest. And we are taping on August 25th for what I'm going to call our Back to School episode. Leading Voices is so much about imagining career paths for young people getting into the real estate business. That's one of my themes on the show. So you, running the Schack Institute at NYU, get to talk about students and what they're interested in, why they're coming into real estate and why they're not coming into real estate. So we have a lot to talk about that, plus your research. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm really delighted to be here. Absolutely, we'll call it the back to school episode. I am in full on back to school mode right now. We're really, really thrilled. I mean, we've made moves over the last couple of semesters to open up campus, bring students back in larger numbers. There have been some bumps in the road, particularly as it relates to some of our non-US students. We have a very robust and dynamic international student population. Mm-hmm. Like other universities, not everyone's been able to get their visa in time for the beginning of the semester. But we are currently in the midst of welcoming people back. We're being careful. We've got all the protocols in place. But it is just so exciting to see so many people back on campus and for us to be planning for doing things in person once again this fall.
That's totally true. And I think of my daughter just graduated from city planning at Berkeley. So she just got her master's, and 3 of 4 semesters were online. She didn't get to see her team. And I think so much of a degree is the network that you create, so therefore the relationships you create. So pretty hard to do without that.
Yeah, well, first, congratulations to your daughter. That is a really fantastic program. Your real estate is one of those industries that I think all of your listeners are going to agree, is so relationship-based. Mm-hmm. The network is so critically important. And one of our natural advantages at Schack is that we're in the middle of New York City, and we have access to this extraordinary network. We also have students, particularly the students that have been on our 1-year accelerated track. They are able to complete their master's degree in 12 months by taking intensives during the January semester, during the summer term. Some of those students may have not spent time on campus while they were a graduate student. As soon as we went remote in March of 2020, realizing that this would be one of our primary challenges. We already had considerable experience in online teaching because of many of our certificate and global programs, but ensuring that students had access to an extraordinary network, even if it was the case that they were accessing that network online, was really, really important to us. So we really ran the gamut between sort of events where you would be able to tune in for a panel alongside 1,200, 1,500 other people to hear what Hamid Moghadam or Sam Zell or Debbie Cafaro, their prognostications on the market. Just an amazing, amazing group of people. But At the same time, we hosted a program called Executive in Residence, where we would specifically pair an executive, CEO, very often one of our board members at the Shack Institute, with a group of 5 or 6 or 7 students. So students were able to hear in these very large venues, albeit online, from the biggest names in the industry. But many of those people would come back and then talk to and engage with our students, and again, a group of 5 or 6. And that really provided a nice counterbalance because it gives students the opportunity to engage with an industry leader in a much more intimate setting. So doing this full range of activities, ensuring that students had access to an extraordinary range of opportunities has been absolutely critical for us.
That's fantastic. And you're so lucky to be in New York because you are ground zero for half of what we do in the industry, I think.
So one of the things we're evaluating now, when I look at our fall schedule, we have a program in September that's focused on 20 years of rebuilding and resilience in Lower Manhattan. Larry Silverstein founded the Shack Institute in 1967, so we have a very special connection to Lower Manhattan. But we also will have our 4th National Women's Leadership Symposium in October that will be returning in person, and our 54th Annual Conference on Capital Markets. But in each of these cases, and for all of the events that surround sort of these big marquee programs, I think one of the critical things for us has been to evaluate what are the lessons that we learned over the last year. So much of the conversation in our industry is about, are we going back to the office? Are we going back to the way things were before the pandemic? Of course, I'm a big believer in going back to the office and doing things in person, building those relationships. But it would be a mistake not to also reflect on what are the things that we've learned over the last year and a half. Many of our events will be simulcast. They will be in person, but we also want that young person in another part of the country, another part of the world that may not have access to one of our conferences or events to be able to participate in some way.
Right. So context, talk about, I'm curious about Shack and what it is and what the different programs are. And you've told me it's the largest real estate graduate school program in the world. So I want to hear about that. And then I want to go on to kind of your view of overall real estate higher education, graduate education, what that looks like, and contextually broader. But let's start with Shack.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity. Shack was founded in 1967 by Larry Silverstein and several of his colleagues who are also in leadership roles in the New York City real estate industry. The notion of a master's degree in real estate or an undergraduate degree in real estate, you probably have not caught on at that point. And so he created Shack along with these other industry leaders really to provide continuing education opportunities for working professionals in the real estate industry, which is why, in part, a decision was made at that very early stage that although the core of NYU's campus is on Washington Square, that Shack would be right in Midtown. So to this day, our graduate programs and our continuing education and executive education programs are all right on Bryant Park. And the way I describe it to a prospective student is that, within 10 blocks, we have the largest concentration of real estate capital anywhere in the world. And that is just an amazing advantage. Over the years, we evolved from primarily a continuing education program that offered individual courses, certificates, to ultimately introducing one of the industry's or academia's first master's degrees in real estate. Over the years, that has evolved from a Master of Science in Real Estate, which is students have a choice of finance or asset management, to also adding a Master of Science in Real Estate Development, a Master of Science in Construction Management, and most recently introducing a Bachelor of Science in Real Estate. So we've grown tremendously. We have roughly 850 students in degree granting programs. We also are home to, again, several thousand students participating in continuing and executive education every year. We are home to a number of different research centers, the NYU Urban Lab, which focuses on issues related to cities and the interrelationship between cities, city competitiveness, and the performance of real estate. The NYU Reach Center, the Young Woo Design Lab that is focused on thinking about how we will use space as we look to the future. The Crefsey Center for Commercial Real Estate Finance. This is one of the accomplishments I'm most proud of during my time at Shack. We received a significant endowment gift from the Commercial Real Estate Finance Council to create a new interdisciplinary center that would work closely with Crefsey to provide an academic dimension to their work. And so the CREFC Center is home to our CREFC scholars, our industry fellows, a robust research agenda, a certificate program for CREFC members. I could go on. Suffice it to say, between the conferences, the centers, the students, it is an extraordinarily vibrant community of people and really one of the real estate industry's anchors in global academia.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because through the period of time since you were founded, real estate has become institutionalized. It's one of the themes of my podcast and themes of the work that I do when I think about this, and that real estate has moved from just a collection of assets to business platforms, business culture, business technologies. And the platform, I think, has almost equal weight to a bunch of assets and a bunch of deals. So we're a very different business, and it's become professionalized, using other words as well. So as the industry's evolved, it feels like you've been there to evolve with it. And I'm wondering how young people see real estate as a profession to go into and how that may have evolved along with that as well.
I think it's evolved tremendously, as you point out. And I don't have a firsthand account.
You didn't watch this happen.
I did not watch it happen. SHAC was founded many years before I came into the world. If we were to look at the early curriculum from the late 1960s, early 1970s, I think what we'd see there is that the curriculum, the type of coursework would reflect exactly that industry that you're describing that was early in the process of institutionalizing. Courses may have been primarily focused on negotiations, dispute resolutions, leasing, property operations, the capital markets aspects of it, the robust equity platform education, the data analytics, which is relatively more recent. These are later evolutions, but I think it's not only reflected in a change and an evolution in the courses we offer. And I should say we have a very, very popular course in negotiations and dispute resolution. But apart from introducing coursework that covers the broader range of foundational skills that we think are critical for every early career professional in the real estate industry, the ethos has also evolved as the industry has changed. And so there is a more institutional character to how we think about the built environment, how we think about real estate as a platform. It's also reflected in our student body. About 40% of our graduate students are from abroad. They join us from China, India, Canada, the UK, Germany, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, just an incredibly dynamic community of international students that bring a range of experiences and backgrounds to our programs. A key priority for me in the 6 years that I've been at SHAC has been to enhance the diversity and inclusiveness of our student pipeline. And so we also see that as we have focused a lot of our energy on highlighting for prospective real estate students or young people that maybe hadn't even thought about a career in real estate, that it doesn't matter what your background is, where you grew up, where you went to high school, whether you're from a real estate family or not, we can help you forge a career path in this industry and equip you with the skills, the tools, the knowledge, and the network that you need to be a successful real estate professional. We've been working very hard to then diversify our student population and have been really thrilled over the last couple of years to see it become a more important priority for the industry as employers are thinking about their own recruitment strategies out of undergrad and out of graduate schools.
And you use the word ethos, so it comes to another point. The last two episodes of Leading Voices, the month of August episodes before the back to school episode, was both on the environment and the role of real estate around carbon emissions and sustainability. And so I'm wondering, when you think of ethos, what also, and we think of the built environment responsibility around that stuff, social equity, affordable housing, rebuilding our cities, building great cities. So what does that ethos mean there? What's the connection between your young people and goals for that plus goals for commerce, which coexist really well, I hope, and maybe differences around the world? So just kind of talk about that.
Yeah, and I should mention when you talk about sustainability and environmental issues as it relates to the built environment, one of the centers that we are home to that I didn't mention initially was the Center for the Sustainable Built Environment, which is one of our oldest and longest standing centers that's focused on issues related to sustainability. So I think given the wide range of courses that we offer, the wide range of research interests of our faculty, that invariably attracts a broad and diverse student population. Apart from sort of identifiable characteristics and backgrounds, attracts a diverse set of students in terms of their interests in the real estate industry. Many students are attracted to our program because they see these centers, they see the interests of the faculty as reflections of our priorities. It's essential that every single student has all of those foundational and technical skills. Everyone needs to be able to do real estate financial modeling. Everyone needs to understand cost estimation. But how they express then their interests, how they leverage those tools that we equip them with. When they look at the faculty, my own interests are in a range of different areas that have evolved over time. Cities and equity in cities, issues related to affordable housing, workforce housing, are one of my areas of research. Another is urban epidemiology. And right now, a lot of my focus is on how it is that real estate and cities prepare for, respond to novel public health threats or novel public health shocks, as we've seen during the pandemic. And I firmly believe that over the course of the next several years, we will start to see institutional investors thinking about public health as it relates to real estate in much the same way that they are always carefully thinking about issues related to climate change and how that affects their investment decisions.
Let's come back to your work in epidemiology and urban epidemiology. I'm really curious about that, but that's a rabbit hole because we keep talking about that. Just stick a little bit more with kind of this program. Think of it in the context of other programs, not that they're your competitors, they're your collaborators, because together you are creating the next group of leaders in the real estate industry. And then also think about MBA programs, because half of the people I interview are MBAs, not masters in real estate. And then also one level down, because we're also trying to create career paths for people in property management, hotel management, all that stuff. And they're not coming to Shack, but they're going to, Florida State or something, which may have a program in property management. So how do we create those mindsets towards career path for people to bring them into this industry that it's continuing to institutionalize?
There are a lot of amazing programs out there, including the program at Florida State. There's certainly a healthy competition for the best students across all of the different programs. Your point's well taken on the decision that a lot of our students have to make about whether or not a Master of Science in Real Estate or an MBA might be the most appropriate path for them. I'm very sensitive to that because, prior to coming to Shack 6 years ago, I've lived my entire academic career on the MBA side of this. Depending on sort of where the student is, what they want to get out of the experience, different types of programs are going to offer different benefits and be attractive for different reasons. While there is a healthy degree of competition for those students, and we're also all competing for great faculty, there's a tremendous sense of collegiality and cooperation, collaboration amongst faculty and leaders in the academic real estate community. And so I think not a day goes by that I don't trade notes or a Zoom call or an in-person meeting when circumstances allow with the chair of another department or with a faculty member from another institution.
One thing I view about what you're doing and what ULI does and our trade associations does is raise the bar for professionalism, raise the bar for the belief and responsibility of real estate and the built environment. That's what we're trying to do in the podcast as well. So talk about the ways in which you're helping to do that. And you also do a podcast. You also do real estate research. You're a big spokesperson in the industry. And maybe it's towards that end, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think one of the first things that we do when new students join us is to emphasize right up front that real estate does not happen in isolation, that while the built environment is all around us and how we experience the world is shaped by the built environment in real estate also occur within a larger context. They occur within the context of the city. They occur within the context of the resources that are available to a local and national economy. And the way that we design and invest in the built environment has extraordinary implications for the human condition. But when we think about, or when we're making choices about how to zone land, where to build housing, the kinds of federal or local incentives that we might provide for a workforce or naturally occurring affordable housing, the way in which we invest in the transportation network and what that means for people's access to economic opportunity and employment opportunities. All of these things have enormous implications for our social outcomes, for social mobility, for equity, for economic efficiency.
Right.
You don't have to buy into any of the equity arguments. So when I'm thinking about the importance of ensuring that we have an adequate supply of workforce and naturally occurring affordable housing within major metropolitan areas, the argument I always start with is that if teachers, firemen, policemen, other people who serve the community do not have the opportunity to reside in the communities that they serve, that impacts the long-term economic competitiveness of that city. And really emphasizing sort of the bottom line in very much the same way that I think over time, the arguments in favor of green building, for example, have gravitated towards it being a bottom line argument. It's not only the right thing to do, but for the environment, it's the right thing to do for your bottom line. And really emphasizing the interconnectedness of the equity and efficiency issues when we're thinking about urban planning, when we're thinking about housing, when we're thinking about real estate broadly. That is one of the first things that I think we bring to the table in our engagement with our new students, and as part of our ongoing dialogue with industry. So it is absolutely important to us. When I think about the work that I do, not as the dean of a real estate program, but as also a faculty member who is actively engaged in research, the issues related to the job market, tax policy, and how that's impacting the competitiveness of cities, all of these things that are sort of the larger context of real estate. How do we think about the interrelationship between public health, public spaces, real estate, how we will ultimately use space? There's so much dialogue in our industry. There's an opportunity for it to be even better informed by people who have a background in the overlap between public health issues and real estate, but not just one or the other.
It's interesting. Real estate's probably the most interdisciplinary business there is.
I have to agree.
And so you got to understand all those things. So I'm going to put a pin in this and just go back one click to a couple of questions. And this morning, my heart was broken. I read the New York Times, and there was an article about the guys who built the towers in Miami that fell down, and the architect involved and the developer involved, and they knew they were doing a bad job. So I take that article and, this is what the headlines that someone reads about our industry. Then at the same time, I think about the word landlord, which is not one of the positive words in our lexicon, but maybe could or should be. And I think about the word developer. And then I think about the word rapacious developer because they go together in our lexicon. So think about those kind of the mashup of those kind of dirty words in the popular lexicon, and to think about what we read this morning in the New York Times about these bad guys who built a building and they did a bad job so that people don't have trust in that work that we do. And then think about the place that you sit both at SHAC and as an economist and as a spokesperson for the industry.
I think it's a critical point, and we see this very often at the local level. We see it during mayoral elections. We see it when incentives and subsidies are being offered to encourage major corporations or companies to locate to a metropolitan area. There is, and often is, a degree of distrust between a significant subset of citizens, of households, of taxpayers, and the community, and on one side, and the real estate industry on the other. Does that division, does that mistrust need to be the dominant paradigm? And I don't think it does.
Talk about the challenges and opportunities of having that kind of conversation, and ultimately how that didn't work out well for New York City in the Amazon HQ2 negotiations.
So when real estate may be pushing hard and your city might be the big winner, New York having been one of the markets that one of the two that was selected as a home. And that being really exciting for everyone involved in real estate. It also being a source of very real concern, for residents. And it's understandable why. We are a city that has infrastructure challenges, that has challenges with the delivery of high quality public schooling, where property values are rising, where for the income constrained family doesn't own their home but rents. It's also a market where we see rapid increases in rents, undermining affordability. The idea of a big new employer coming into town, creating lots of high paying jobs. From a headline perspective, why wouldn't you want that? And that's where I think having the sensitivity to say, okay, well, how does this impact a broad range of constituents? Who are the stakeholders that are impacted by this? And I think it's the concerns that were brought to the table were regarding what does this do to congestion? What does this do to the demands on our infrastructure and an already overloaded subway system? What does this mean for strains on our public schools? What does this mean for upward pressure on rents in my neighborhood where I've lived and my family has lived for 30 years, but where continuing investment threatens to displace me and my family and require that I move my son or daughter to a different school? Those are all very, very real concerns. I think with the benefit of hindsight, one of our lessons learned is to be able to make the case for how the relocation of a major company, will benefit the market, but how those benefits will then be reinvested into the community. There probably was not as clear and as loud an articulation as there could have been with the benefit of hindsight of, okay, so the new tax dollars, the new jobs, whether it be from the local wage taxes, whether it be from property taxes, how can we think about then allocating funds and resources to address some of the challenges that already exist and some of the challenges that clearly will be exacerbated by the arrival of a very, very big new anchor player? I really see the kind of thing that can be resolved by greater dialogue and understanding of the impacts of real estate development and investment decisions on a broad range of constituents.
I think it's true. I think the issue, it's interesting, two things. One is I've heard a lot lately that, hey, things work at the local level, but they don't work at the national level in our politics. So that's comment one. But this is proving that that's not true. Then the second thing is what we said before, which is complex interdisciplinary issues. They're really hard in our body politic to deal with because you're dealing with subtleties. So, hey, here's 10 subtleties together. What do you think? We don't know how to digest that anymore.
Yeah, your complicated politics are not only at the national level.
Yeah.
I will say that my Monday morning quarterback assessment of what went right and wrong with that particular corporate decision to come to New York and then ultimately not to, in as visible a way. There are lots of different views on what went right and what went wrong. So I offer one view on this. I would say that, from an urban economist perspective, pitting cities against one another in competition for a business headquarters in a way that drives, in a partly political dynamic, the offering of ever increasing incentives is not a dynamic that ultimately is in the best interests of cities. We want to see cities collaborate. We want to see them think about how they can compete in ways that ultimately don't undermine their competitiveness.
Totally true. Well, and bully for Crystal City, which really needed to be. Crystal City is not a blank canvas, but it's a canvas that can be repainted. Everyone agrees, and it will be in Northern Virginia where Amazon is going. So let's change the subject a little bit, stick with cities for a minute, and then we're going to talk about you. But so talk about resilient cities and how cities kind of come out of COVID. And then I also want to talk concurrently with those cities that rise up to equal the core cities, because Nashville, Seattle, maybe Seattle's already a core city, but Nashville, Austin, Denver, all these other cities are now very, very viable places. Salt Lake City are growing like wildfire. So kind of talk about each of those together coming out of COVID.
Yeah, and actually, Salt Lake is actually one of my favorite cities, and
Great
has been
place
for a long time.
Yeah.
And not just because of the city, which is very, very livable, but visiting friends at the University of Utah and their business school, being able to look out the window and see the mountains. But to your point, I think if you and I were having this conversation with any of our friends in Seattle or Austin or Salt Lake, they would immediately have jumped in and interrupted us and said that, what are you talking about? We are core cities. There's no question of it. There are a couple of different things here. I did a study a number of years ago for NAOP, and this was just after or in the later stages of the great financial crisis, focused on the recovery dynamics or the business cycle, real estate cycle dynamics of secondary and tertiary markets. So on the equity and the debt side, we observe changes in the availability and flow of capital at different points in the cycle. And part of what motivated this was that although New York City was for many people, the epicenter of the financial crisis, it was also the first city to begin recovering. Not necessarily in terms of the underlying fundamentals of the properties, but in terms of the inflows of capital. And having to sort of explain and make sense of the dynamics of where is capital flowing and why do we sometimes observe that it is not coincident with or reactive to the strength of the underlying fundamentals, but in part relates to scale economies, was part of this analysis. We have certainly seen during the last year and a half, part of the dialogue in our industry being focused on the relative competitiveness of different cities, the notion that we have been observing a mass exodus from the well-established urban centers like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, DC, Boston, to San Francisco, LA, to sort of this newer set of cities that are typically, if not always, sort of south of New York, but sort of the Sun Belt markets, everywhere from Florida to Salt Lake, Denver, and Las Vegas. And Austin being sort of an absolute superstar performer in all of this. One of the challenges for economists during the last 18, 19 months has been that the data we've had access to, the reliable, consistent public data sources, and even many of the private data sources have either are published with and made available with a significant lag, which makes it difficult for us to be responsive to things that are happening in real time. The real story here is one where your median professional or service worker is still bound to and tied to their job, which has a specific location. They may be going in 2 days a week or 3 days a week. They may not know yet. They may have an idea they'll be going in 2 or 3 or 4 days a week instead of every day. But they're still ultimately tied to a geographic location because they're going in less frequently, though. Within the metropolitan area within which they reside, there is a broader radius over which they can now optimize. So, for example, I go in every day. I'm in a people-facing business in academia. I don't want to do a 1.5 hour commute each way every day. I'm going to live, close to my campus. If it was the case that, I was only going in 2 days a week, then I'd say, you know what? I also care about a good quality public school. I care about proximity to a large, quiet park. I may be able to optimize my location preference over a larger geographic radius because now my consideration is not only, my utility maximization is not only about how I minimize my commute to work. I can do the 1.5 hour commute each way if it's only 2 or 3 days. So what we see is a larger number of people that are sort of a greater dispersion of the population, across the metropolitan area, but not people moving across the country if they still need to come in a couple of days. Never heard so much noise in our industry as I have about this issue. Exactly where that equilibrium will be, is being driven by many different things, demographics, not least amongst them. But the notion that the city is dying and that people are abandoning the urban core is absolutely anecdotal and not based in the evidence.
It's so interesting because people want and need an answer. Okay, urban's dead. Those other cities are alive. But it's going to be an and, not an either or, 100%. Yeah. Although it's really interesting, as you said this, you're reminding me when I started the podcast three and a half years ago, I walked to work every day. And then since COVID, now I walk upstairs every day because I no longer live in the urban core. I live in the country, just like I did. I've done exactly what you said. So now I tell everyone, hey, I live in Sonoma. Isn't this cool? versus walking to work in downtown San Francisco. So I'm probably emblematic of that change because being in the office won't be essential to my particular job, and therefore I'll vote with my feet in terms of how I do that.
Well, residents are not abandoning en masse. Cities cannot take it for granted that everyone will stay. You have to work to maintain the value proposition for your residents.
And that is so critical because in San Francisco, we've been questioning that, particularly questioning that with, the pain of homelessness, the pain of taxes, and the pain of NIMBYism. But we have to move on.
So all of that to say that we've had to rely over the course of the pandemic to an increasing degree on a range of alternative or novel data sources, from the mail forwarding data from the U.S. Postal Service, data from United Van Lines or other moving companies. Where are people moving to? I think what we see is that while there are certainly cases of folks relocating, from New York to Miami, what we also see is that is not the dominant trend. More often than not, what we see is that, and this is really...
It's a noisy trend, but not the dominant trend.
Right, yeah.
So the last question before we talk about you is you've said 2 or 3 times that you have been studying urban epidemiology. And what does that mean? And what does that mean coming out of COVID?
I think it is an interdisciplinary sort of undertaking. I have 2 areas of focus in my academic life. One is economics, and the other is epidemiology and infectious diseases. The urban epidemiology for me is the overlap of these 2 otherwise very, very disparate things.
Yep.
And so, where I felt that there was a need to really bridge those 2 and explore the overlap is that we've had so much dialogue in our industry about everything from the fitness of the Delta variant to sort of what kind of HVAC systems we should have installed in our buildings. But we've undertaken that very, very important conversation in relative isolation as a real estate industry. We're making big, big decisions about the built environment based on sometimes solely on sort of what we heard on the NBC Nightly News. So to bring some deeper expertise in issues related to epidemiology, to how we think about real estate, is this area that I call urban epidemiology. I should say in terms of research output that's intended for the private industry as opposed to an academic audience. It's also been a very fruitful area for me to sort of generate some impact. So, one of the things I do is to go through the New England Journal of Medicine, to go through other journals that would sort of outside the scope of what I would do as an economist on a typical day, but to say, okay, well, what are the findings from this latest research? What are we seeing in the preprint servers? What are the implications of this research for real estate? That engenders and facilitates a more informed conversation about how we're thinking about real estate and the urban environment than looking at it solely through the lens of a real estate person who's aware of what's going on sort of in the broader public health context. So that's how I define urban epidemiology. And
so let me pose a question, and it's around the subject. So I'm going to make a bet that the muscles we've gained during COVID may be similar muscles to dealing with climate change, flooding, terrorism, because we have to work together to solve a problem. And I'm thinking that those things that we actually did work together with on this one will prepare us for the next thing, be it another disease or be it another terrorist strike or be it a big flood. Any thoughts about that?
I think sort of you're coming to this a really critical point that in economics, we would define this as issues related to externalities, right? So climate change is about the impact that we each generate from our individual activity, but where that impact, negative or positive, is internalized by everyone else around us. But all of us sort of internalize that, whether it's climate change, whether it's sort of the textbook example of noise or pollution. In sort of a classic economics textbook, you'll read about sort of, a factory that is polluting a river, and then how is that impacting everyone else downstream? They don't internalize that cost. The choices that we make as individuals and the choices that we make collectively as relates to our public health, there's an externality element to this. And so there is a common thread, as you've described, tying many of these different issues together, and many of those muscles will need to be exercised.
I hate to say we're going to exercise them again. So let's totally change the subject. And how did you get here into this business? What brought you to do this crazy thing that you do? You grew up in Canada. You have about a bunch of degrees, all Ivy. So talk about that.
I had no idea. I came to the United States to do my undergrad at Wharton.
From where? Where'd you grow up?
From Canada. Canada. I was actually born in the UK, in London. And then as a kid, came to Canada for school, for university. Ottawa, and my family's now in Montreal. Came to the United States for undergrad and have essentially remained here, bouncing around sort of the East Coast for different degrees, as you mentioned. My first opportunity to really work in the real estate industry, as I mentioned, I was doing my dissertation. My chair for my dissertation committee was a senior professor in the finance department at Wharton, who remains sort of one of my key mentors in life. For one of the papers that I was writing, I needed a data set on apartment rents. And I was looking at the way in which school quality was being capitalized into the value of real estate. Because the idea that public schooling is free, ignores that it's expensive to live near a good quality public school because it gets capitalized in. But I wanted to quantify this.
Right.
So I approached Reese and Lloyd Linford at the time, and I need this apartment data set for my dissertation. And the folks at Reese were kind enough to make that available. They lured me in. I spent several years as Reese's chief economist. We took the company public. Of course, Reese has subsequently gone through a couple of other lives and is now part of Moody's Analytics. But I was really grateful for the opportunity to be part of that team when we went public, and have spent some time with Bob White as the global chief economist at Real Capital Analytics. Have started a couple of companies, but I've always had one foot grounded very, very firmly in academia. Have a great team of researchers on the private side, where I provide strategic insight into the areas where I want us to grow our research impact, but a really amazing group of people that actually execute on that research in areas related to economic forecasting, various areas of the real estate industry. We do a lot of stuff on the debt side of the market, litigation support, but also urban epidemiology.
So those are parallel. You do both same time. So you do Shack and you have Shandon Economics. Is that what that?
Yeah, and so I think Shandon Economics have got a really fantastic team. They essentially run it, and they actually seem to do it better without me there. So it's being the dean of Shack is definitely a 24/7 commitment. I provide sort of strategic insight. I have no day-to-day responsibilities at Shandon. And at the end of the day, I love working with students. I love working with faculty. I love doing the research. It's not the most lucrative undertaking, but in terms of just how incredibly rewarding it feels to be able to impact policy thinking about how it is that we can improve the lives of people in our communities, whether it be through more efficient CMBS bond pricing or through a MERV filters in our office buildings. It's mission driven for me, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else other than academia. It's where I have the opportunity to impact the world.
That's wonderful. I love hearing that. So talk about, you're also the chair and founder of the Real Estate Pride Council. So this will be a different kind of diversity than we've talked about on the podcast before, but talk about that in the real estate industry.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it briefly. One thing I'm very mindful of is that we've tended to silo our thinking in the industry when it has come to issues around diversity and inclusion. And we were very focused on, as an industry, how do we improve outcomes at every level of the organization for women entering real estate. I think there's been a greater focus on the experience of people of color over the last year and a half. And I think for many of us, it's been an area of focus for much longer. The larger circumstances of our national and public dialogue and discourse has brought it to a greater degree of prominence over the last year. But when we think about diversity and inclusion, by definition, it's broad. And it's about not identifying individual categories or silos, but how do we think about an approach that it embraces diversity and inclusion in the many ways in which it will express itself. And very often we miss in our D&I conversation in real estate for just as two examples of communities that may not come up in the D&I conversation. People who are differently abled is an element and an expression of diversity. People who identify as LGBTQ+ are also part of that larger diversity. we've been working very hard to think about how we can create frameworks for developing platforms that are supportive of diversity and inclusion, however it is that it expresses itself. At the same time, in talking to many of my students, what I find is that they have many of the same concerns and worries and anxieties that I had as a student. When I was thinking about, can I be out during the job search? Will it impair my ability to land that dream job? Will it impact my progress in the company? Does this mean I'm not going to get invited to the golf game, to the ski trip? But that I won't identify, a mentor or a champion for myself in the organization because there isn't going to be anyone on the management team who sees me and identifies with me. Irrespective of whatever that dimension of diversity is, these are issues that everyone faces. A couple of the things that we wanted to do with the Pride Council, one of our basic missions was simply to create visibility.
Yeah.
That young people who find our website, our Twitter feed, whatever it is, should be able to see there are successful people in the real estate industry that have been out. You can do both. You can be authentic to who you are and still succeed. That in itself is a critical part of our core mission. The other is to support all the industry associations out there and all the companies out there that may have different affinity groups, but for whom tackling and addressing LGBTQ plus inclusivity maybe hasn't been on their radar. Mm-hmm. A lot of this is about engagement with industry associations, with groups that reflect the intersectionality that many of us experience, to say, how can we create visibility? How can we create environments that are supportive of diversity and inclusion, given broad and ever-expanding ways in which it expresses itself within our community?
It's interesting. You're reminding me of 20 years ago when I started as a recruiter, and I had one of the first gay guys I dealt with as a recruiter. We became really good friends over the years, and he was applying for a job, and I approached the subject gingerly, but I said, I don't know if you're going to be comfortable or happy in this organization. It was a question I just didn't have an answer to. And we've now moved from will you be comfortable and happy there, because you ask the same question for women, you ask the same question for African Americans, and the industry has to, and is only on its pathway to becoming a more comfortable place for everyone besides white guys. It's just,
and very much like when we engage with folks in thinking about climate change or public health, we see diversity and inclusion and creating an environment that is supportive of and welcoming of people from different backgrounds and experiences and identities as being part of your profit imperative.
Yeah, totally true. And it's interesting because if a company doesn't want you, you're not going to go there, but their loss. And once we can start saying that by pounding our chest, then that's a beautiful thing. The last question always on Leading Voices in Real Estate is your advice to young people getting into the real estate industry.
Learn as much as you can, meet everyone you can, immerse yourself in it, and keep a very, very open mind. It's fine for your interests, your focus within real estate to evolve over time. Be ready to take some risks, but be smart and you'll learn as much as you can, and all of those things will pay off in the end.
Cool. And go to Shack. Great program. Or another program, because they're all, you got it, they're all good.
There are all so many fantastic programs out there, including my alma mater. But right now, yes, I am carrying the purple flag for NYU and the Shack Institute.
Fair deal. Hey, Sam, thank you so much for being on Leading Voices. We'll keep in touch. This has been great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening into Leading Voices, and I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I have a request. If you enjoyed the episode and found it to be valuable, please share it with a friend or two. If they're podcast wary, take their smartphone in your hand and subscribe for them and teach them to listen. You'll change their life. Seriously, thanks for listening and keep in touch. You know you can reach me at matt@terrasearchpartners.com. See you next time.